Sophie Hardy and the Changeling Hybrid by M.R. Dale. Narrated by Leona Hall. Chapter 24. Split. Sophie zoned into the toilets just outside the Year 3 classroom and went to walk into the room that was hers 3 years ago. Before even stepping into it, she noticed that every room was empty. A panic started to take over her. Had the changelings already taken everybody? She got on the radio to Miss Sissons but got no answer. Racing round to the Year 6 classroom, where she knew the other three would be, Sophie saw through the window that Clara, Yasmin and Kingsley were also standing in an empty room with panicked expressions all over their faces. Sophie threw open the door to the classroom and went to speak. Before she could do, though, someone walked into the back door of the classroom and stopped her. "What are you lot doing in here?" Mrs. Tabard asked, apparently completely surprised at seeing children in a classroom. "Why? Where should we be?" Yasmin asked cautiously, trying desperately to not come off as rude or to get them all into trouble because they weren't around when the instructions were given. "In the hall with everyone else," Mrs. Tabard snapped back. "I thought Mrs. J was joking when she said to make sure no children have suddenly appeared somewhere else in the school when they should all be in the hall." Sophie noted the careful wording that Mrs. Jones had used when instructing Mrs. Tabard. Then she breathed a strained sigh of relief and turned to head to the hall. The three others did the same, and with no other rooms left to check, Mrs. Tabard followed them. When they had walked through the school and found themselves at the entrance to the hall, Mrs. Tabard overtook the four of them and flung the door open, then proceeded to prop the door open with her back and announced to the whole school that she had successfully rounded up a group of stray Year 6s who were found conspiring in the classroom. Mrs. Jones, who was standing at the front of the hall, leading the second impromptu assembly of the week, said nothing to the four of them, but gave Sophie a look that implied she was more than a little suspicious of her and couldn't wait to question her later. She then looked at Mrs. Tabard and gave her a slight scorn for interrupting the assembly mid-flow. Teachers apparently had a strong dislike for that. Sophie, Clara and Yasmin sat down on the benches at the back, but Kingsley was forced to stand at the end as there was no room left on the benches, and Mrs. Jones kindly recapped what she had said so far. The girls did their best to hunch up, but no room could be made for Kingsley. He didn't mind, though. He was just glad he had some people looking out for him, and so eventually he perched himself on the floor to avoid standing out too much. So, as I was saying, Mrs. Jones wasn't taking her eyes off Sophie. Mrs. Phoenix has had to go home ill, and as a result, Year 6 will be split for the afternoon. "I can cover them for you if you like," Mrs. Tabard shouted from her position as door holder opener that she hadn't realised was now redundant. "It's okay, Mrs. Tabard," Mrs. Jones began, still not taking her glare off Sophie, who was now shuffling in her seat and feeling very uncomfortable. "We can't ask you to cover again. I need to keep an eye on some of them." Sophie realised that last bit was aimed at her and her gang of three others, but the others hadn't seen or heard most of the conversations Sophie had had with Mrs. Jones after Mrs. Phoenix had been sent away. They might have been a bit more clued in had they had heard it. The whole school then proceeded to listen to which class each of the Year 6s could be going into. It was no surprise to Sophie that she, Clara, Yasmin and Kingsley would all be making their way to Mrs. Jones's class for the afternoon to be watched by Mrs. Jones. Yasmin, however, saw this as a positive. "At least we're all together," she whispered down the line to Sophie in the split second that Mrs. Jones wasn't looking at them. Sophie just shrugged and wondered how they were supposed to zone out into scope to find the changelings if their absence would be noticed so easily. Mrs. Jones then dismissed each class starting from the youngest and the accompanying Year 6s. She missed out her class as she wanted to lead them down to the classroom herself. As a result, Sophie, Clara, Yasmin and Kingsley were the last ones to leave the hall. Almost as soon as they had stood up, all four of them got red lights in the corner of their eyes. Miss Sissons was the sender, so they didn't need to read the message, as they knew what it was going to say. Sophie looked anyway. It started. "Get here, now." "Already?" Sophie asked, suddenly feeling rather worried. "What do we do now?" Yasmin asked, clearly getting nervous as well. "We can't all go," Clara replied, slightly calmer. "Yas and Kingsley stay," Sophie said, taking control of the situation. "I'm in trouble anyway. You can say Clara has gone to another class by accident. If Mrs. Jones wants to go and fetch her, let us know and she can come back." Why have I got to stay? Kingsley asked, who for years had been the one getting into trouble for scrapes and arguing with teachers. This girl Sophie was on another level to him, though. We're trained to do this, Sophie replied. How many times have you done it? Kingsley asked, straight-faced. None, Yasmin replied, not thinking before she spoke. I'm coming then, Kingsley insisted. If I can't, then I'll just tell the teacher exactly what's going on. Fair enough, said Sophie, deciding it was probably for the best to not call Kingsley's bluff, and the three disappeared, leaving Yasmin all alone at the back of the Year 3 line to face any questions from Mrs. Jones when the inevitable happened.